such a pleasure to be part of this panel and to have amazing women next to myself. I'm going to just leave it to our moderator, Allison, to take it over.
Great, thank you. To start, I would like to ask Pantea, how did this Forgotten Women of Science exhibition come about?
Well, before I talk about that, my work in general is about the role epistemic images played in communicating knowledge in early science. And for that, I study medieval and early modern scientific manuscripts. But then the Forgotten Women of Science as a project and art exhibition started in 2018 when I was invited to participate in a group exhibition with the theme #MeToo. It was then that I thought I should include a female scientist for that exhibition. After researching a few female scientists, I picked Hypatia of Alexandria, a 4th century mathematician and philosopher who was very involved in the politics of her time and was brutally murdered. As an artist, naturally, I need to be very connected with the subjects I work with. So reading through women scientists' biographies, I found myself to be very, very inspired by their stories, by their achievements, and also their struggles. And some of these women were also artists, activists, suffragists, educators. So they were really involved in different parts of their societies. And something really interesting happened during this process that I was reading about these female scientists. I felt really angry that I didn't know about most of them. I think that anger and the passion I felt for their work ultimately led to my decision to create an art exhibition that I can highlight some of them for the public. So my art exhibition at the San Jose Museum of Quilts and Textiles features lesser acknowledged women from ancient times to the 19th century because this year we are celebrating the centennial of women's suffrage movement.
So you mentioned that there are artists who are also activists or scientists who are also activists. And we have a scientist on our panel, Dr. Suzanne Pierre. How does being a scientist relate to you being an activist as well?
I became interested in science, and particularly the environment, and but there were so many different factors about that intimidated me away from science and made me kind of basically say that's not something I could do. But when I did realize that perhaps I could major in a STEM field and maybe even go on to graduate school in science, it began to intersect with my activist identity in that I noticed that there were some barriers to me entering STEM that did not exist for other people, particularly my male peers and especially my white peers. And so that disparity kind of engaged my activist side, and that's been a big part of my identity, even going into my PhD and beyond, is addressing why that is and doing my best in different ways to dismantle that. So.
Cool. So you noticed that there were some challenges that you faced, and some of it being your belief that you could be a scientist.
Yeah, no, it started there for sure. That hesitation, I think that exists for women in general, and you see that in the demographics of classrooms in engineering and in definitely math and what we consider the hard sciences in general. But and that's also an area where we see disparity among ethnic groups as well. And so I guess my hesitation was transmuted into kind of a desire for action. And that's how I came to be, I guess, sitting on this stage.
Pantea, did you have, when you were doing your research or in your life, did you notice that there were specific groups of people that you found represented or not represented as scientists?
Well, this project was a very specific project that I started in 2018. And during the course of my research, I found a few times that the profile of some of these female scientists were not consistent in different sources. And that just was really frustrating and difficult for me to conclude ideas and thoughts about the work I wanted to do about them. But then, as frustrating as it was for me, I decided to actually bring this experience into my exhibition. So when you see the works, there are some panels in the exhibitions that have biographies of these female scientists, and parts of the biographies are either crossed out or manipulated with threads. I just wanted to have a commentary in my exhibition about this kind of difficulty of finding authentic data on these early female scientists that I was just actually researching.
Cassie, you are a historian and you study physicians and midwives from 17th century France. Do you have thoughts on how women how women convey information through history?
Absolutely. My interest in women's health comes from being a practitioner of women's health as well, and looking at how things evolved historically is my research currently. And the way that really women have communicated has been very hidden. It's been face-to-face, neighbors, families. And in the process of doing my research and coming upon someone who actually was the first female midwife, and yes, there were male midwives, the first female midwife to author a text, has been extremely enlightening. This particular woman is Louise Bourgeois, and through her networking and through her tremendous experience of working with over 2,000 cases of caring for women, she was able to get herself into a position of being the royal midwife to the Queen of France. And this was at a time where a woman's worth was really dependent upon producing heirs to the throne, or if you were a typical woman, then it was producing children to assist the family. And with this pressure, women took on one of the most dangerous stages of their life, which was having children. And so to have a practitioner who had so much experience and she had the vision to share this experience through writing the first text, making it accessible to other practitioners to train them, as well as to women themselves to care for their own health when they could, was extremely forward thinking. And very much she saw the combination of the rise in literacy that was happening at that time and the ability and access to printing. And so she put these things together to empower and train other practitioners and have women be able to take on some of the responsibility for their own health. So this was really an amazing way to communicate at the time. And it opened the door to future publications at a time when it was completely dominated by men. And the medical hierarchy was dominated by university-trained Latin reading physicians and surgeons below them. So midwives not having any access to university training, not having access to Latin education, this was just a tremendous resource for them to be able to read in their vernacular language and to have her shared experience. And she turned in her experiential learning into a written work to communicate with her colleagues.
Sue, do you have so you are currently a woman scientist in a relatively male-dominated field, similar to Louise Bourgeois.
We probably have only that in common.
Making connections.
Yeah.
How has that experience been?
So just in general, what is that like? Okay, I'll try to not go on and on about it.
Specific challenges with regards to publishing?
Yeah, let me, I think what's interesting, only interesting when I zoom out from it, because being in it, it's more frustrating than interesting. Well, for context and for everyone listening, I'm an environmental scientist. My training is in ecology and biogeochemistry, so I study climate change and how climate change is influencing the health and development of forests, and I, in particular, think about how microbes are the mediators of that. So it's really kind of an in-the-weeds kind of look at what's happening to the environment right now, and as Allison said, it's totally true. It's male-dominated and it's white-dominated, and both of those things, in some ways can rub up against just the normal things that I want to do as a professional, right? You wouldn't expect it all the time, but when it creeps up, I find that who speaks, for example, in different environments, in those of us with any kind of college or university experiences can probably relate to the idea of being not called on. And it turns out that does happen at the highest levels of academia. And that can be so frustrating because not only is it unfair, but it controls who gets to contribute to what we're thinking about and what the dialogue is in that room. And it turns out that can actually shape what ideas come to the forefront. And that affects everybody, right? If there's only, or if the channel for what gets introduced in terms of science is narrowed to only a certain demographic of people, we're potentially missing out on so many critical ideas that could help society. And so that's been something I really push back against. And I try to do that both up and down, right? It's really hard to kind of change that from when you're talking to 60-year-old, 70-year-old male professors who are coming from a totally different generation of training and science. But I find that I can make inroads where by who I mentor and who I give attention to as far as students, undergraduates, and even high school students in some cases. So I guess I could keep going on about what's difficult, but I'm also trying to spotlight the ways that we can reach horizontally and reach down to kind of impact who kind of matriculates into the canon of science. So
I have actually I connect with what you're saying, but then in a different way, because I went through 4 years of science training with the aim of becoming a doctor. And this is a goal that I abandoned for pursuing an art career, because while I was getting this training for science, I was also getting training for art. So I was actually quite lucky that I had these two paths kind of going simultaneously. But then I felt like the world of science at the time for me, it was very closed off. It wasn't open to I don't necessarily know it was about women or it was about a visual learner, which I was and I have been at the time. So I felt like it was very closed off. I did not find a lot of narrative stories, connections with life, connections with other aspects of, basically life that makes this science more tangible, more kind of like accessible. And that was why I left that world. But I'm sure if I had gone into it, I would have gotten, to that point that would just see some of the things that you just described. Yeah.
For me, rather than my personal experience, if I look at historically women's healthcare, it was traditionally carried on by women throughout antiquity, either their own family members or neighbors. And then we reach a period in the Renaissance, the early modern times, where it starts to become very medicalized and taken over by men. And then slowly we see the process changing again. Now today, for instance, Stanford just took in their most recent class of medical students, and there are more women than men in this current class. So it's an evolving process where women have certainly made their place.
Are there examples throughout your research or through your work as a medical professional where art or visuals are particularly necessary?
Definitely. The basic study of medicine starts with anatomy, and that's particularly what drew me to this subject. I'm fascinated by that in my own studies, and the best way to depict that and give that access is through artwork. The feasibility of teaching off of cadavers just wasn't very possible in ancient times or throughout some of these historical periods. And it was one of the things that Louise Bourgeois was advocating for, but we were heavily reliant on that time through artwork. And I think if we look at some of the pictures, this one on the right is some artwork that I was looking at, and it actually describes, this is a pessary or something used to help with uterine prolapse. And there's text from the Renaissance period that talk about doctors encountering these in women, and they had been made by either the midwife helping them or possibly the woman themselves that the midwife taught. But it was unbeknownst to the doctor. He had never seen this type of device. He wasn't something he was recommending. But through the artwork and the knowledge that was passed around, we have examples of it. It's something still in use today. And this material culture that existed is really the best insight and inroad for us to know what was happening at the time when most women did not write and share this information. Same thing is true of herbals. We have books with pictures of different herbs that could be used for healing, and women amongst themselves would trade these recipes for different diseases and conditions that came up. And this was an important process in sharing medical knowledge, and very much traced through the art at the time.
And I have actually, following this conversation, I have a slide about one of the female scientists that I have featured in my exhibition on one of the panels. In 12th century, she was active in southern Italy, in Salerno, and she was part of a very thoughtful group of women who could write and work out a lot of recipes for women's health and beauty. So her manuscript only was translated from Latin once in 16th century, and then it was all forgotten until the late 20th century. And the translation and the edited version is by Dr. Monica Green, and I had access to it. So as you can see, the bottles are also on this slide. So in my exhibition, I have created a section that is called Apothecary, and it has the original recipes from this woman from 12th century about women's health and beauty. And it was all natural elements that they used, the herbals that you mentioned, and seeds, and some even marshmallows. She has a recipe that uses marshmallows. So I would like actually to try some of them, and lots of wine. Everything was cooked. It was cooked in a big pot of wine, I guess, and they would just say, "Drink it." But I found it quite really, really enticing for me, and to create a kind of conceptual piece out of it. So this is kind of a representative of how women actually cared about themselves at the time, I guess, at some point, that they took it on as a project.
And sometimes these recipes were referred to by men as being secret. There's a lot of interest in the male community as to women's secrets and what they were sharing. But these weren't secrets. They were things openly discussed and shared amongst each other for the mutual benefit.
We're living in a self-care age now. I guess all ages are, but it seems to be a buzzword. Are there ways that you use self-care or like beauty products that are related to your work or contradictory to your work?
I don't think I was going to say my regime is, my regimen anyway is like probably lacking a lot of time. So I think as far as connecting that to my science work, I do think that there's, how do I say this? In science, I guess if you think about the traditional scientist, you're not thinking of someone with bright red lipstick on, right? And I think that that's really kind of relating back to the material cultures of maybe medieval women. But if we think about women scientists now, do we associate makeup with a present day scientist? And typically the answer is no. So there's something interesting to me about beauty and how you physically represent yourself as it connects to how you are viewed as a professional kind of creator of knowledge and discoverer of things. And because that's been so normatively male and therefore not associated with beauty, there's something really powerful about showing up in the lab and wearing bright red lipstick. So one thing that I'll say about beauty is that young women scientists are pushing back against those norms of how you present yourself by presenting themselves as they would anywhere else, right? Come into the lab, and as long as you're doing lab safety, wearing big hoop earrings is actually something that is a way of rewriting who's normally a scientist. Wearing makeup and not having that contradict your professionalism or your ability to be taken seriously as a scientist is another way of pushing back. So yeah, sometimes I'll wear lipstick in the lab because why not? And anyone who's questioning that, I think, needs to question why.
I think I have an appreciation for the ability to really be ourselves and do as we want now as much as possible. Historically, that just wasn't the case. There were very rigid restrictions for women most of the time and how they could present themselves. And so when you do come across someone who really manages to break down gender barriers and cross through those, it's just so refreshing and really something that we need to share and know more about, which is so important in today's presentation, is this exposure to people who haven't been as visible lately. But we owe so much to them.
When you go to the gallery, you see quotes from this manuscript that are all on the wall. And I kind of related that experience with one of my female scientists, Mary Ward. Mary Ward was a 19th century Irish scientist and artist. And she was also an entomologist, so she had a big interest in observing nature through microscope. But she couldn't go to university because women were not allowed at the time to attend universities. And I can't even imagine how frustrating it was for her not to be able to express herself, and then reading lectures on females, manners and education. I'm kind of, wow, I just put myself in Mary Ward's position, thinking, oh, I want to be a scientist, but I have to sit around the table with other women and do this generic, needlework and embroidery type of work. So when I looked at her work, you can see some of the images on the slide. I was blown away by her artistry and by her passion and will to be a scientist. She wrote constantly to universities and male scientists in order to obtain information, and this is how she learned. I created a piece that I printed her images on fabric, and I don't have any background in needlework or embroidery, but I thought I have to do it for Mary Ward. And I sat down and started just like stitching through the fabric and reading her book, and some of the kind of look I have for this piece are similar to animal hair, because she really observed them through the microscope. And this piece is kind of like, a tribute to her after reading the manuscript about how women should behave in the 18th and 19th centuries in England and Ireland. I thought I should do a piece and imagine myself a scientist and artist doing my own work in both ways, both angles, yeah.
I think even here in our own country, the beginning of women's education and finally colleges for women opening in the same time period in the, say, 1700s, women still were doing embroidery. That was one of the primary teachings. And when they started teaching science, it began the science of the kitchen, taught by men to women. But that was the basic science classes. So it's a starting place, and it is.
Well, this manuscript was written by a man, like how women should behave and what they should do. And it was quite a thick manuscript.
He had a lot to say. I'll just interject one additional layer that I kind of was reminded of in this conversation, which is, the text you're talking about is about how a woman should be and how she should present and the roles that she should fulfill. And it's kind of a document about how to be a respectable woman. And maybe some of the audience members have heard the term respectability politics, which is about how people, especially people of color and Black people in the United States, are expected to present themselves in a way that allows them to be respected and therefore taken seriously. And this is across, sectors of life. And just bringing it back to science, I think about how this text is a weird analog for the respectability politics of how we should be presenting ourselves in order to be taken seriously in the lab, at academic conferences, in the lecture hall, and whether those standards for how to be respectable and proper are different for different people. What are the ways that a scientist of color might need to do just a little bit more in terms of presentation and demeanor to maintain their respectability. And so there are some weird and troubling overlaps there between gender and race identity from the past and now. So.
One other thing that I love about this piece is that, this is changing the subject but it's, the needle point looks like it would be a petri dish or in a microscope. And I just love that there's the tie to what women should do, but also the actual scientific work.
That was actually what I had in mind. It's great that you said that, because I thought the embroidery hoop could be the field of vision and the eyepiece of the microscope. So it's kind of like an opening into this world that she saw, and it just brings it to attention.
Cassie, you mentioned earlier work where men are teaching women different things, or women will have their own knowledge separate from men. Can you elaborate on your research proposing that the female body was a figurative and literal medical training zone?
Sure. I use the metaphor of trading zone in this sense to really represent a reciprocal exchange of substantial knowledge and experiential learning. And one of the things I want to convey is that the body of the female, the woman, really did bring about an exchange of information. As a birth became complicated, or women had health problems, you would have various practitioners called to her side, and the midwife would be joined by a surgeon or a physician or an apothecary. And it allowed for a true exchange of information and discovery between the practitioners. It was really a special place in medicine where this could happen, because it wasn't happening in universities. It wasn't happening in training settings. They didn't have the same access. So it's something interesting to think about, and I think it still applies today that women allow this exchange to happen just in their being. And I'm curious to see exactly where my research will end up, because it's not finished. But this is really my starting point, that it's not just a hierarchy of all male down, that women were able to push information up, and starting from the basic place of their bodies.
We have a few questions now. So this is for Pantea. Where did you go for research, and what were your resources?
Well, some of the research I've done for this exhibition are coming from online resources, articles, books, but then I travel to different libraries if I need to. So I've been to MIT. I had an exhibition there, but then I had the chance to also research some of these women. And Mary Ward's manuscript I saw at MIT. Then I was in Dublin, Ireland, and I had this opportunity to be at Marsh's library. I jumped on it, and I just did some research about women, as I explained. The British Library, I've been to the British Library. So different libraries, different resources, but something that is hard sometimes, I am not a historian and I am not a scientist. I have to teach myself a lot of these concepts, terms, and some of my search and kind of like, how do I say, like, looking up something could prolong for hours and hours, because I find a term there and I'm like, oh, what does that mean? And then it goes on to another, which is a good thing, but then I need to make sure I have enough time for that. So if it happens, I can just, kind of embrace it.
This next question is, what strategies did you develop to achieve success in your field and work around a male-dominated field? So I think this could fit for
all of us, but I would
different fields, but yeah. What strategies? I think knowing when the battle is worth fighting is one thing that I use to strategically circumvent challenges that are not going to advance me or women. There are certain conflicts. I'm trying to come up with a useful example, but there are these moments where someone, maybe a male colleague, might hear what you say in a meeting, for example, and repeat that thing as though they said it first. And I know that that's something that occurs probably in a lot of different sectors, but that moment is really frustrating, but it's a catch-22 in a lot of cases, because again, going back to respectability, you don't want to be the person that's like, hey, I said that, excuse me, and that can be a challenge that creates further challenges. So one strategy is kind of noting where there's something that's teachable and useful, and something that can potentially set up a standard for the future that people will, and particularly male colleagues, will remember and can change the course. And in other cases, kind of just saying, all right, this one is not going to make a huge difference for us all. That's one. You got to save your energy sometimes. Yeah.
I think also, for me, it's a bit about filling in the gaps. I've been very fortunate in having amazing mentors, and that's not always the case if you're in a male-dominated area. So I try to give back and fill in that gap by mentoring others. And I think that's something that women really have to think of, ways to support each other. So that would be my point.
And for me, I don't think about it as much as an artist.
I'm going to take the liberty to answer this one as well. I'm also a scientist, and the way that Pantea and I were connected is through an organization that I'm a part of called 500 Women Scientists. And this organization has the goal of changing the face of science and holding institutions accountable, and also harnessing our collective power. And so that's one strategy that I've employed, is banding together with other women. This question is, how can those in power help underrepresented voices in your respective fields?
That's a tough one.
I could talk about this for far too long, so let's, maybe I'll say that the most salient thing that comes up over and over again is listening. Those with power and those with ability to make change from the top can often come from perspectives that are not representative of those most marginalized by the practices and systems in place. That's true for women, and I think that time has shown that women being in power allows more women identified people to be supported by power structures. But I think listening in general is one of the ways that people with resources and people with power can kind of hand the mic over to those who otherwise wouldn't have that voice or be able to pull those levers.
As a bad example of what to do, I have two colleagues who are both older male professors, and another female professor has described them as they interrupt before they listen. And that just eats me.
Yeah. But no, totally. I mean, but that's
So
exactly,
true.
that's like the thing gone wrong, like listening actually does mean don't talk, literally make space. So actually making environments and situations kind of like this, where people who might not otherwise have the voice or the opportunity, are given the floor. And so it's cultural, but it's also, what are the times and spaces that we can afford to others. In addition to where we gaze, it's looking at our own biases and lenses. So people in power, there are things that all of us don't notice about how we behave or treat others, and those blind spots can really shape so much. So maybe just committing to doing a little bit of introspection and noticing your own blind spots can be huge and transformative.
How can history be used to convince young women to enter hard science fields? It's a very interesting one.
Well, I can answer that question because the idea that I'm working with these medieval scientific manuscripts, it's an interesting, kind of like process for me. Because I did not become a scientist and I abandoned that idea, all these years I've been after that thought, how I can reconnect with science. And it was until I saw these beautiful scientific manuscript pages that had amazing images and calligraphic, text that explained all of these, different abstract ideas. They looked beautiful. But then I asked myself, if I want to understand science, how does this process work for me? I needed to start with history. How did that happen? How I became who I am? And that curiosity just became really, really strong to a point that I had to research these medieval scientific manuscripts to understand early science through history. But then, of course, I thought the project would not only reflect my interest in art, but science, history, and research. And I've been really grateful for these archival materials that are available so I can go through them. I mean, your work is about history too. It's a very, very different feel, and it's so empowering to know there were people behind us before us who did all of these works while their times were also difficult, and especially for women in the case of my exhibition. So for me, history is a very important, subject, and the way that we can learn from it, the narrative, the storytelling part of it, yeah.
I also think that the public in general would benefit from historical thinking. It's really a way of analyzing events by the context that they happened in. So this is something that could be very interesting to science as well. But okay, we know an event happened, but what was going on that led to that? What were the situations, the impetus? And using that type of thinking and analysis, I think, applies to many areas of our life.
I'll just say that my history was really important for me deciding to pursue science. And I don't know if I can say like whether history would influence young women in general to go into the hard sciences. But when I first started thinking about science, it was scary, as I mentioned earlier, but also kind of seemed like a superpower. And what really moved me to kind of take a leap that was very intimidating was the idea that people like me until the present day generally didn't have that superpower. And there was something really incredible about the idea that becoming familiar with these tools and methods and ways of analyzing the natural world could be, part of my toolkit. But then by becoming a scientist, I was actually joining a group of people that made the knowledge that we have that allows us to do, make decisions, make policies, make inventions, and kind of holding that space and being a young brown woman was like this opportunity to change history. And so even though I was like very like, oh no, I'm gonna flunk out, I actually, history and my place in history really shaped that decision. So
yeah, I'm thinking of the phrase that you're the history of the future.
Hey, yeah, exactly right. Yeah,
and helping. I think that is one of the ways to help convince young women to enter these fields is to be there and do it.
Yeah.
I'm wondering what are the next steps for the three of you on the horizon?
Oh, everyone's looking at me.
Everyone
just goes, it's true, it's true.
You have lots of next
I have
steps.
some next steps. Okay, well, at the moment, I am a postdoctoral researcher at Berkeley, UC Berkeley, and but my job there is concluding, and I'm starting in about a week as the environmental scientist for the Exploratorium Museum in San Francisco. So if you come to the Exploratorium, maybe I'll see you and run into you there. I also am I'm going to be continuing research at Berkeley, so if you go on suzannepierre.com, you can learn about what I'm researching. And one other project that I and a collaborator are working on now is called the Critical Ecology Laboratory. And so if you think about all of the things that we've talked about on this panel, and you're curious about that, you might be curious about the Critical Ecology Lab, which is basically an sort of parallel lab to academic science. And what we want to do is create a third space, like a hub for environmental and climate research that is both doing the hard science and also bringing in all of these conversations about equality, justice, access, and a more fair and equal future. And so this lab is saying, traditional academic science doesn't always give us the space to ask these questions. What might it look like if scientists, artists, writers, and activists actually have an additional laboratory outside of that? So we're a not-for-profit organization, and we're just getting off the ground. So criticalecology.space is where you can start to look at what we've got, but it's in the works. So, yeah.
I'm planning on finishing up research on this particular project in December of this year. I also took a little break just to finish a chapter in a textbook on medical ethics. And then in the future, I'm really interested in taking scientific research and through my writing, making it more accessible to the general public. So I'm working with a lab at Stanford on that does autism research, and that's probably the next project I'll take on. But this particular subject may turn into a book or a larger project as well.
And for me, I'm just at the beginning of this path to research more female scientists, and I'm really hopeful that from now on, I will bring more of these pioneers in my near future and future exhibitions. But then my medieval scientific manuscript projects in the area of medicinal botany and astronomy are also in progress. But now I've had this, the Forgotten Women of Science. I'm kind of thinking I should have an exhibition with the title, The Forgotten Women of Art. So that just came to my mind that maybe I should have an exhibition like that too. But all in all, I am really, really happy that I had this opportunity to learn about female scientists, so I can just, work with them as well as with other subjects that I've been on for the past few years. Yeah.
Yes.
And what's next for you, Allison? What are you working on?
So I'm a researcher at the University of California, Riverside. I was in Berkeley for about 5 years before this. I study climate change and agriculture, and I'm focused on dairies. So trying to figure out how we can mitigate climate change using different agricultural practices, and also maintain a food secure future. And then I have one other project that I'm really excited about called the Climate Music Project. And here I provide climate data to musicians, to composers, and work with them to translate the data into musical works, which is super awesome. It's the Climate Music Project, and that's based in San Francisco.
And this is really exciting to see a scientist collaborating with artists. And this is this has been my dream to be able to just cross-connect and create all these connections with scientists and historians. So
I feel like we're the opposites, because I wanted to be a musician and became a scientist, and she wanted to be a scientist and became an artist. So I definitely see more collaborations with this group in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.